Welcome to the Ayurveda for Women's Health podcast, where we simplify ancient Ayurvedic wisdom into practical guidance for everyday life. Between the overwhelming wellness trends, quick fixes, and conflicting health advice out there, we return to a science that has been around for thousands of years. I'm Rita, an Ayurvedic health counselor.
And I'm Brittni, an Ayurveda practitioner. In a world that disconnects us from our bodies, we are here to guide you back. Through body literacy, practical tools, and time-tested science, we will help you step boldly into a more empowered, aligned version of yourself. So let's dive in. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Views expressed do not represent our employers.
Hey, Brittni.
Hey, Rita.
How's it going?
It's good. We're back.
We're back. I hear Rosa in the background. Is she trying to be part of the podcast today?
She is always trying to be a part of the podcast. She wants to be here just as much as me. Yeah, she's a little rambunctious today, but so it goes.
So it goes.
Yeah.
So it goes. Winston's at daycare today. Otherwise, he'd be rambunctious right next to me. Yeah.
If only we were in person together and they could just play and like wear themselves out and then we could record it.
Exactly. We'll have to do that sometime. Yeah. Well, what are we talking about today?
Well, today, this is part 2 of our initial conversation about digestion. And so last episode, we talked more about what is digestion and what does it actually mean for our health, and how does it work. And now we're going to talk about more of the imbalances that you can see in digestion and also how to think about them from the Ayurvedic perspective so that you can start to find a path towards healing or balancing them.
Yeah. And I think, we talked a little bit on that last episode that just being clear that digestive issues are something we all experience from time to time, including your Ayurvedic practitioners as well. They also can be such an overlooked area. And so, yeah, I think it'll be helpful in this episode to just break things down a little bit further and get into a little bit more detail as to the types of imbalances and what that means. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, maybe before we get into digestive imbalances, let's talk a little bit about what balanced digestion looks like. And again, we, talked in the last episode that digestion is an ever-moving target. It's something that's in flux. And so to say that this is what balanced digestion looks like doesn't mean that this is what your digestion is going to look like 365 days a year. But essentially, it's the target that we're all moving towards. So one aspect of that is strong and consistent appetite. So feeling hungry for meals. And ideally, we're having some level of consistency around mealtime so that we're feeling that hunger and then eating our meal soon after. We look at digestion as kind of this front end versus back end. So front end, soon after we eat, we really don't want to be experiencing any significant symptoms. So no significant gas or bloating or indigestion, heaviness, acid reflux. We want to feel good after we eat a meal. We want to feel satisfied. And then on the back end of things, we want to have regularity. So ideally seeing bowel movements 1 to 3 times a day. That's dependent on your constitution. 3 is not necessarily better than 1. It very much is dependent on your constitution and your normal. But we want to see at least a bowel movement a day, and we want those bowel movements to feel complete as well.
Yeah, I think it's great to start with that because then okay, if this fluctuates at all, how can I get back to my baseline, right? And that's kind of like the baseline we're working towards is that it feels easy, it feels complete, it feels regular, and no matter what you're eating. Really, we want to make sure you're having strong enough digestion and healthy enough digestion that you can eat things out of the norm, so to speak, and it's not going to impact those bowel movements or how you're feeling or how you're digesting.
Yeah. So what we tend to see when we talk about imbalanced digestion is we see these three different patterns. And you'll hear us talk about these three different patterns, these three different doshas in many different contexts in Ayurvedic medicine. And so, maybe just to give a brief overview here, we're really talking about the elements. And we know in Ayurvedic medicine, it's a 5 element system. We have space, we have air or wind, you have fire, water, and earth. And these elements tend to pair together, and we have we have space and air that pair together. We call that Vata. Fire and water tend to pair together. We call that Pitta, and earth and water come together, and we call that Kapha. So sometimes people, like, I might have lost you already. So we'll bring it down and get a little bit more granular here and go through each one. So, a Vata type imbalance, or a different way to say that, is when we have excess air in space or wind in space in our body. One of the ways that that can look is there's a lot of irregularity. If we think about wind, wind is not consistent. It's very irregular in the way that it moves. And so we can see this irregularity in terms of hunger. There can be this very drastic swing where you're really, really hungry and then not feeling hungry at all. On the front end, when there's this excess of air and space in the body, we can experience things like gas and bloating and belching. Sometimes even some pain can be a factor soon after we eat. That's really what we're seeing when there's excess air and space going on in the stomach. When I say front end, like within those couple hours after eating. And then when we see excess air and space going on in the back end, meaning more in the intestines and in the colon, in that regard, we can see dryness. So it can look like hard, dry stool, kind of rabbit pellet type
Mhm.
stool, or just a really dry stool that's hard to expel. And sometimes, because there is that irregularity with Vata, we can see this fluctuation too. So we can see this fluctuation of the hard, dry stool and constipation, and then some fluctuation with diarrhea and loose stool as well. As like we finally were able to move a bowel movement out.
Yeah, it's like kind of extreme
Yes.
in that sense, which we resonate with the space element, right? If you're having those extreme diarrhea or constipation, it's like fluctuating. There's something extreme is going on and we want to like soften that and bring back some gentleness to it.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Anything else that you want to say about that pattern?
No, I think that's a really great summary. I think as we're talking through these, I do recommend going back to our first conversation in terms of looking for those tips of how to balance. Like Rita, you're saying that irregular pattern can be very prominent in this type of imbalance. And so, where's that irregularity happening relative to digestion? Is it how you're eating? Is it happening on that front end? Is it eating habits? Is it meal like spacing, like we were talking about in the first episode? Or if we're looking at the back end, thinking about, okay, is there dryness in the system? Is there not enough moisture? So, first looking at like, is it front end or back end? Like, where is it happening? And then looking at where do those other qualities like irregularity or inconsistency, where is that happening relative to either the front end or the back end?
Yes. Yeah. Good call out. Yeah. So if we go into the next pattern here, so the next pattern being Pitta, and Pitta is the embodiment of fire and water. So when we're talking about having an excess of Pitta, an excess of fire and water, that can look like an excess of heat and sharpness and intensity as well. So, from a hunger standpoint, when we have a lot of pitta going on in the GI tract and in our Agni and our digestive strength, what that can look like is really intense hunger. like being very, very hangry if you have skipped a meal. Or maybe it's not hangry, maybe it's like a big blood sugar drop. Again, we've talked before and we'll talk more in the future about how certain constitutions, like Pitta constitutions, you're going to naturally be a little bit more hangry if you skip meals. Not saying that it's necessarily an imbalance, but it's something when it gets to an extreme we can see as an imbalance, if that makes sense. And on the front end, when we have this excess heat going on in the stomach, that can look like acid reflux, sour stomach, um, this just hyperacidity that we can feel almost like a little queasy after we eat because there's this excess of acidity going on. And then on the back end, when we're having this excess of pitta, this excess of heat and fire and water in the digestive tract, in the lower part of the digestive tract, the large intestine colon, then we're going to see frequent and loose stool. So there can be an urgency there, like needing to use the restroom soon after you have your meal. Or sometimes we'll see that urgency like a couple hours after your meal because it's like as soon as it hits the intestines, there's so much inflammation and heat there that it's just getting pushed right through. So urgency, loose stool, or frequent stool, if we're having bowel movements more than that 3 times a day, that could be an indication of excess heat going on in the GI tract.
Yeah, and especially if you're having like a lot of bowel movements that aren't complete,
Yes.
and you're having like, I'm having like six to, if you're having more than three a day and they're not feeling complete and they're feeling that urgent feeling you're describing, or there's no pattern to them, that can be a sign that pitta is in excess somewhere in the system.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
And, for all of these, we're always bringing in the opposite qualities. So, if we have too much heat going on, we're wanting to bring in foods that are bioenergetically cooling and herbs that are cooling and soothing. Part of why we're trying to identify these patterns is so that we can apply this concept in Ayurveda that essentially is like increases like and opposites create balance. So, when we have excess heat going on in the GI tract, we need to back away from heating foods and heating practices in our life and bring in a little bit more of the cooling and soothing practices.
Yeah, and I would even add to that, like, that fast pace can
Hmm.
be very aggravating, right? So if like eating really fast, just intensity anywhere, whether it's through diet, lifestyle, behavior, really like slowing down and breathing, bringing some coolness through your breath to cool your insides really can help to calm some of that overheated fire that's just like raging somewhere in the body.
Yeah. 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 I think where we compare in the last episode our digestion to a fire, that's how Ayurvedic medicine thinks of it. Agni translates as digestive fire. The pitta type of imbalance is a bonfire. Like the fire is too intense. The food's going right through you.
Yeah.
We gotta cool and calm and soothe that down. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, Rita. Like with Pitta, we also have it's fire and it's water, right? And just highlighting the water element of Pitta imbalances where there can be like this, I want to say like dampness, where it's almost like the water can be dampening that flame, right? And so it's
Mm.
kind of like the fire's kinda there, but kinda not, and it's like it's almost smothered a little bit, like, sometimes that wetness can take over to like, the body's trying to flush that out as well, and that can be some of that excess kind of extreme movement happening is like it's trying to move that out.
Yes, totally. I think that's a good call out. I think whenever I see pitta imbalance, I'm looking at is it more of a dry type, like more
Mm,
of a fire imbalance, or is it more of a wet fire imbalance, if that makes sense? There's like
yeah.
some dampness involved there. Yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Yeah, and with Pitta too, with fire and with water, we can see movement in a certain way, and so we can see a spreading quality, and that's where I think of that acid reflux kind of
Hmm.
has that. It's not just like at one particular point in the body, it's moving upward, right? It's like this whole section of your chest here that's feeling that indigestion. So I think of that as like this kinda almost like a consistent but extreme intense spreading, whereas like Vata might be kind of more irregular and can't really find a pattern to it. Pitta is going to be like sharp and intense and kind of spreading outward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great call out. Yeah. Yeah. And then to go into our third type here, so our third category of digestive imbalance is Kapha, and Kapha is the embodiment of earth and water. So if we think about the qualities going on with earth and water, there's a slowness there, there's a heaviness there, a sluggishness there. We can call this sluggish digestion. And so, on an appetite level, we'll see really low hunger and low appetite. On the front end, after eating a meal, we might experience heaviness in the stomach, like just that feeling that there's some bricks sitting in my stomach right now. There can be just general indigestion, tiredness after meals, like soon after you eat, I think can be a really big indication of this imbalance pattern. And then on the back end, when we have this excess of earth and water in the large intestine colon, that's where we see more sluggishness in the bowels. So a little different from the Vata type that is harder to pass because it's really dry. When we're seeing sluggish stools, it's more that the stool might be sticky. And so it's harder to pass, not necessarily from dryness, but from stickiness. We might see that stickiness in the toilet bowl as well. There might be an oiliness to the stool. It's an important distinction, I think, when we're talking about general constipation as defined as, not having a bowel movement every day. Well, is there a dryness, a hardness, or is there like a slowness, a stickiness? And sometimes both, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really important to call out that distinction because I've had clients describe them differently, but kind of meaning the other one. And so it just kind of takes more questioning to understand what's just like you're saying, like, well, is it dry or is it moist? And that can give more information about it. And it's kind of those bowel movements where like you feel like you're just like wiping and wiping and wiping, and you're like, how am I going to go through like the whole toilet paper roll? It's just like so sticky. That is like a heavy kapha. Like it's like mud, right? Like if you think about
Yeah.
mud, it just kind of sticks to everything, and like you can't get it
Yeah.
off your shoes and you got to like clean them off. And it's kind of like that. So that quality, that stickiness, that like texture, that's a heavy, sluggish kapha type imbalance.
Yes. Yes. As you're describing that, I'm like, that's such a great way to describe it. And then I'm also thinking, like, I wonder how many people are listening to this not with headphones and their partners or friends or family are like, what are you listening to right now? But welcome to Ayurveda. We talk about poop a lot.
Come on over.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say on the sluggish digestion piece too is that sometimes I think we can actually see acid reflux with that pattern. And it's interesting because the first pattern where we have this excess heat, we're going to have this excess of our digestive juices that are happening. Like we can have this excess of hydrochloric acid and not enough mucosal lining in the stomach. And therefore, that excess acid is going to move up the lower esophagus, like you said, Brittni. But I think sometimes when our digestion is very, very sluggish and the food is not moving through our stomach fast enough, what can happen is the lower esophageal sphincter, which is essentially this little door at the very base of the esophagus, top of the stomach, if our stomach is not emptying and there's food that's sitting in there, it will trigger that sphincter to open back up. And we can have some acid reflux that happens there. It may not feel the same. It may not feel like that hot burning spreading, but it's that same concept still of food coming back up. And I think that's a really important distinction because what ends up happening is people can have that type of reflux and end up going on reflux medications like proton pump inhibitors. I think the most common is omeprazole. And what happens is that's then decreasing the amount of gastric juices that you're producing. Well, if you have sluggish digestion, it's because we don't have enough gastric juices. So it can actually end up making your reflux so much worse. And that's just something that I see very often in my practice. I think PPIs are very overprescribed in general. I think Western medicine doesn't have a lot of tools to work with digestion, and it's one that I think is far overused, even by the standards of proton pump inhibitors. Like if you look at the research, it's something that's recommended for most to go on for like a few months, and people end up on it for years and years and years. And, I'm will always, anytime I talk about pharmaceuticals, I feel the need to do the disclaimer. There's a time and place, and I think it's good to have them, but I just wanted to call that out.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that because it highlights the difference in the medical systems where Ayurveda, you're coming to Ayurvedic practitioner and you're like, I have indigestion. And we're looking at it from this lens of, well, is it Pitta type or is it Kapha type? And we're exploring that. And is it this heat type or is it this sluggish type? As you go to a Western practitioner or a doctor, and just like you're saying, they're going to prescribe a blanket prescription for either one of them, but it's not actually addressing the root cause of why you're having that indigestion. And so that just highlights the difference in the approach. And that's where understanding who you're going to and what type of recommendations they're going to make can be really helpful in setting the expectation of what you might get when you go for that care.
Yes. Well said. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And, I did want to make sure to say, too, when we're talking about these three different patterns, sometimes people do fall fully into one. And sometimes, and maybe even a little bit more commonly, we end up with a combination. And that could look like, maybe the Pitta Kapha, if there's both of those things going on, maybe I have this really intense, hangry appetite. And so I will therefore, grab this huge plate of food, but then on the kind of lower part of that digestion, there's not enough to break that down. So then I end up experiencing some of that sluggishness and stickiness because there's this mismatch going on energetically.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think we often see that with like IBS type situations too, like you're describing, where it's not just one dosha involved, right? It's not just a pitta or a vata or a kapha. Like often in IBS, we see pitta and vata involved, and we think about those as the very active, mobile doshas, right? So they're like using a lot of energy, and that's where sometimes going back to what we said before, like you might experience some constipation, and then sometimes it's diarrhea, and it alternates, and we start to see it's like, well, wait, I'm having both from these two different types. I think in that case, we start looking at, well, if there's this like excess, this intensity, this mobility, we're thinking slowing down and soothing as opposed to like warming or cooling. We're thinking about kind of neutral. We're
Mm.
thinking about softening and gentleness as opposed to I need to balance this with coolness or I need to balance this with heat.
Yeah, and bring in the nervous system piece when we're talking about IBS, right? Which Western medicine does recognize that connection for sure.
Hmm.
But I think, again, Ayurveda can offer so much more around really practical tools for supporting the nervous system, which is really key when we're experiencing IBS. There's such a strong connection there.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, maybe you brought up IBS. Maybe
Hmm.
should we talk about a few other really common GI disorders that kind of give a little bit of that Ayurvedic lens?
Yeah. Let's dive into that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we were talking about pitta type, so that excess fire and water, that bonfire, if you will, one that comes up is Crohn's. And with Crohn's, so often people will experience this loose, urgent, frequent stool where I've worked with individuals with Crohn's who it's so debilitating, like they can't leave the house or be in a place where they can be in an unknown proximity to the bathroom. It's really can get quite extreme. And we know that there's an autoimmune component with Crohn's, but it's something I guess what I wanted to say on that is I think sometimes when people have these extent of digestive issues, they can sort of sometimes land in a place of like, oh, well, I don't know how much I can do about this because it's an autoimmune issue, because it's like to this extent of dis-ease. But everything that we talked about in our past episode about the meal spacing and the chewing and finding the right foods that are aligned with your pattern of imbalances, like with Crohn's, we really need to bring in the cooling foods, bioenergetically cooling foods bitter greens, cooked bitter greens, and herbs like cilantro and parsley and these cooling herbs and these different ingredients that quite literally soothe the mucosal lining of the GI tract and also expel excess heat. And so I just wanted to say there's so much that Ayurveda can do even when digestive imbalances get to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really important because I agree with you. I think when people kind of have that identity with, well, now I'm labeled as like having this condition or this disease or this autoimmune, disease, then they kind of move into this other box. It's like,
Mm.
oh, well, now these simple things aren't going to work for me anymore. I need to like take this very harsh approach to this disease that I have. And that's just not the case with how Ayurveda approaches finding balance. And just like you're saying, the power of these herbs and foods have an effect on how our digestive system is working and moving and the type of energy it's creating. And so if we think about these plants coming in, like if you think about just like a fire through the whole digestive tract, right? And you bring in these plants that are cooling, some like coconut water, even
Mhm.
like coconut milk, something that's very soothing and cooling. Think about like that energy like radiating out into that fire. And it's just going to like soothe it and calm it and cool it and help it move down. Like, right, those bitters help move things down and out. So we're looking at like plant energetics
Mhm.
when we're addressing these. And that's very different than taking a synthetic medication or a medication that you may be prescribed for life. And usually there can be a place for both. Like,
Mhm.
have that conversation with the right people and your doctor. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing, one or the other. They can coexist to support those, more extreme cases of a more developed disease.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that reminder that it doesn't have to be one or the other, and that I think especially in cases like Crohn's, I know that sometimes people are getting infusions or on a certain level of medication that I personally am not gonna ever recommend that you would stop that, but when we work in conjunction and you can be managing that piece with your Western medicine doctor and using food as medicine with your Eastern medicine providers, it can go a long way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we overlook how foods can be heating, right? Like onion
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
garlic, things that are so staple in the diet and so staple in, how we cook at home even. But those are both very heating, both very pungent, and both creating more heat in the body. And so it can be a very just helpful to like go through changing the spices from being intense to being a little more subtle, more cooling, more gentle, just like leaning in that direction can make a really big difference.
Yeah. Yeah, and coffee is what
And
comes up
coffee.
as you were saying that coffee is so heating and drying and I think can be a really big culprit with a lot of digestive issues. But I also appreciate that not everyone is looking to get off of coffee, and I respect
Yeah.
that, and I do think that there's some middle ground that we can bring in, like, we can bring certain things into your coffee or
Mhm.
making sure you're having your coffee with your meal so that if you have this intense fire going on throughout your GI tract, this inflammation going on, it's gonna hit differently if you have coffee first thing on an empty stomach versus if you have your coffee with your breakfast, and maybe we put a little ghee in your coffee, a little pinch of cardamom in your coffee, some
Yeah.
things to bring in a little bit more of that sweet, cooling unctuousness that will balance out that like heating, drying aspect of coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and like using spices is really helpful for this, right? Like even cardamom like cuts that acidity
Hmm.
and like specifically. So like that's a great one for those situations. So but yeah, really important point there. Like it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can try these, it's lifestyle medicine,
Yeah.
nutritional medicine.
Well, and one thing I actually am thinking we should call out is specifically in this conversation on Crohn's and excess heat and inflammation throughout the GI tract. I want to be clear that when we're talking about bioenergetically cooling foods, I don't necessarily or really at all mean cold foods. So I think sometimes people can look at this and think like, "Oh, okay, I need to have like smoothies and raw salads," and those can be harder for the GI tract to break down. Anytime our digestion is weaker, whether it's IBS or Crohn's or GERD or whatever's going on, it's really important that we're eating easier to digest foods, which essentially equates to cooked foods, is going to be easier for the body to break down. And so it's cooked foods that are maybe a warm temperature, but have those bioenergetically cooling properties, like you said.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and that actually makes me think of something going back to, like, a Pitta type digestion,
Hmm.
where if you miss that meal, right, like, you have this over intensity of that digestive fire, like, it's ready for food, but it's not getting it. We kind of create this like, then when you do eat, there's so much heat that it, like, incinerates the food. It
Mm,
basically burns the food. So then all of that food you're eating is getting just getting burnt like, there's no nutrition left, you're just burning it in there.
yeah.
So that is what can lead to ama, right? Like, that leads to that toxic buildup going through your veins and getting to your tissues. So you just reminded me of that to, like, call that out in terms of a pitta, like, that really strong digestion, to listen to those hunger cues when they are there and not ignore them, because that can lead to like the opposite kind of imbalance that you would see. Like, yes, you're eating, but the food is just getting like so overcooked so quickly that it's like you might as well just like eat you burnt food.
Mm.
Like over like overcharred food, which yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, so maybe if we jump to a couple other common digestive diagnoses, another one that comes to mind is diverticulosis. That can be really common, which essentially is when you end up having these pouches or diverticula that form in the colon wall. And so if we think about what we've talked about in terms of the different organs involved in digestion, we've talked about the colon is a Vata organ. And so when we see these pouches, essentially how that forms is we have this excess of Vata that's happening. We have this excess upward movement that's happening that we've talked about a little bit in the last episode, that can be common if we're having a lot going on sensory wise, mentally, we're really busy, like there's a lot of energy coming up to the head, then we're seeing this lack of flow, this lack of down and out movement from the pelvis. And so essentially we're talking constipation is one of the big drivers of diverticulosis, is that we will see these pouches form, one because stool is sitting in the colon for longer than we want it there, and also there's this excess dryness and there's this upward movement that's like pulling against the lining. And so what can happen is then we have these pouches that form, and therefore little piecey foods like nuts and seeds and whatnot can get stuck into those pouches, and then that can turn into diverticulitis, which is like inflammation. And so now we see this pitta component come in, and we see this excess fire going on, because of what started as vata is now this excess fire and excess pitta. So one of the major ways that we've managed a diverticulitis in Ayurvedic medicine is, one, we need to make sure we are avoiding those certain foods that can get stuck like that. But I think it's really interesting, like in Western medicine, they'll talk about completely avoiding, nuts and seeds and those types of foods. Where I think Ayurveda can add an interesting lens is it's going to be completely different if you're eating nuts dry versus if you're cooking your nuts like in your breakfast porridge, right? And that's been something when I've worked with clients with diverticulosis, it can feel really good to be able to bring these foods back in, these nutrient dense foods back in, that but bringing them in a way that they're cooked within food and we feel more comfortable with how they digest. And again, as all disclaimers go, this isn't medical advice. Always talk to your doctor, work with your practitioner, all those things. But um essentially, when we are working with this disease in the body, it's really important that we're getting bowels moving. And we're also trying to really retone the colon because there's these pouches that have formed. We're trying to get it toned back up. So Triphala can be a really, really powerful remedy in the right constitution and the right person when we're experiencing this, both to support that regularity and also to help with the toning aspects of the colon and healing those pouches themselves. So I think that Ayurvedic medicine has a lot to offer the people who are experiencing this diagnosis in particular, because otherwise it's a lot of just bubble wrapping the diet and trying to avoid the attack from happening.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot of folks have some sort of imbalance, or like you're saying, they're not digesting it or something, it's causing something, and they just take it out and they just like don't have it, right? And then you're not getting that diversity that's supporting your microbiome and like your gut flora and like all of these different other benefits that it has for nutrition and for the ecosystem of the digestive tract. So I think we have to remember that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing, because it sounds like in this case, Rita, like what you're describing is that Vata is at the root of that imbalance. So what do? Well, we address Vata, right? We bring in more moisture and lubrication and we get
Yes.
things moving down instead of
Yes.
up. We bring in more warmth and easy to digest, and it might not be forever like this, you might be able to like eat those hard things again in the right way that's supportive. Um so it's not like, oh, this is now my diet for the rest of my life. It's that paying attention and having awareness and knowing how to support the body in that moment to that, which does support your long-term health. So yeah, it's a really great explanation of I think of the both the doshas, but and the how the elements are involved there too, and how we see this very often in imbalances where it starts with one dosha and that bumps into the to another one, right?
Yeah.
And I think we'll talk about that some more in a couple other examples, but it's very common where that's where understanding the root cause of it and like when it really started, why it started, like what factors were leading to that causation, that's what you want to address first, because you don't want to address like the periphery. That's not really going to get to the heart of the problem. So you want to start at the heart of the problem.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Well, I guess just one last, GI imbalance that we can talk about, and then we'll move into like women's specific imbalances related to digestion. But hemorrhoids are
Mm.
so common, so common, and I think it's also one of those things that people are like so ashamed to talk about. And really, we're looking at how digestion is functioning, and the hemorrhoid itself is basically this like pushing outward, right? It's like this pushing outward on the skin. And when we think about what are the pushing doshas, well, we have Vata and we have Pitta as the pushing doshas. Those are like the movers, the things that are taking something and moving it to another place, as opposed to Kapha is just like staying exactly where it is and maybe growing. Vata and Pitta are pushing things out of place and into other areas of the body. So with hemorrhoids, we would look at Agni. Very often it's related to how digestion is working, very simply. Whereas if you're having constipation and things aren't moving easily, you're going to have this tendency to push. And eventually that's going to push out these other little like sacs on the skin. So in that case, we're addressing Vata, right? We're making sure your bowel movements are becoming easier to move out of the body, eliminate that waste. And then Pitta as well. Like if you have bowel movements that are really hot, really intense, really urgent, like you were describing earlier, that can create a lot of discomfort. On those anal glands are very, very sensitive. It's like very sensitive, thin skin. So even having urgent bowels can disrupt that area of the digestive tract. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll just say I think it's so great that we're having these conversations. Like I said, this might be a episode that you're not wanting to listen to with a ton of people around but at the same time it's like we need to talk about these things.
Yeah.
We need to talk about our poop and we need to talk about these weird symptoms that happen surrounding our bowel movements,
Yeah.
and hemorrhoids are so common. So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, me too. It's funny. I used to be so like grossed out by talking about like poop and like the body in this way. And then I entered in this line of work and was like, oh, yeah, like tell me more. This is so fascinating because it's like getting to know the body and how the body works and just how to support it. And it's biology, right? It's science and it's how all of these systems are working together. And yeah, I really appreciate it now. And I have some clients that still they're like, I don't want to like, is that weird for me to say? And I'm like, I've heard it all at this point. Like, this is why I'm here. This is what we talk about. Bodies are fascinating and can be confusing. And like, we're here to, support that. So,
Well, it's kind of fascinating. When you were saying that, I was remembering that for so much of my life, like childhood and teenage years, I had a lot of anxiety around using a public bathroom to have a bowel movement. Like I would only have a bowel movement if I was at home, and to the extent where I would feel like really sick if I was out somewhere and had to have a bowel movement, but it wasn't even conscious. It was this interesting mental emotional mix up thing happening where I physically couldn't, even though I felt like I needed to. And so I almost feel like there's some inner child healing happening as we're having these very open conversations about bowel movements, because I don't experience that now. And I think that's probably really common for people.
yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you said that because even when I worked in an office, I just would be like so self-conscious about going to the bathroom. But I have a very pitta digestion. Like I'll go in the morning and usually also have an afternoon bowel movement like every day. And it was really hard at the office and I found myself like holding it in. And it's interesting, like I also was at the time was having more period pain. Actually, we'll talk about that. Maybe this is our segue into like female imbalances related to digestion because I was just creating more congestion in the pelvic area and I was kind of holding it in and surpassing that urge to go to the bathroom. And I think this is really common for a lot of people if you're not in the right situation or the right setup or like it's not a comfortable place to go. And for me, that created a lot of congestion in the pelvic area. So we start to look at, well, what's in the pelvic area? Well, we have the colon, we have the uterus, we have the bladder, like we have all these organs that are kind of expandable as things come into them and they fill up, right? And so then we have all of these things in the same place, like really congested and blocked and full, and it's creating all this stagnation. So like even your uterus right before bleeding and during bleeding, your uterus can expand to 3 times the size, right? So you have this like full of blood uterus, it's like pushing against the colon, and if there's constipation in the colon, where's it all going to go, right? And that's where we start to see bloating and we start to see discomfort and we see pain, and lower back pain is really common with that. So that can be one area where if you're experiencing constipation and you're having menstrual pain, it can be part contributing to that reason, right? There's just a lot of stagnation in that area. So we've got to get things moving down and out.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll start with maybe the big one that I hear so often from so many women is this estrogen dominance. And I just want to explain that a little bit more because I think it's started to be something that's just like thrown around and it's like, oh, maybe I have that. Oh, maybe this is what I have. But not really fully understanding it. And I won't go into like all the depth of it, but basically when we have a bowel movement, we're moving hormones out of the body. That's part of where they are binding like with fiber, right? Fiber is really supportive in helping to move things out, specifically estrogen. It also binds with bile, which is released and eliminated through our bowel movements. So we want to make sure that things are moving down and out in all the ways that we just described, right? Like how to have those healthy, regular, consistent bowel movements. But estrogen becomes really important because what we start to see, if estrogen specifically is not being moved out of the body, it will get reabsorbed. Right. So then we have an excess number of estrogen running through our system at the time where where we're supposed to be flushing it out of our system. Right. And in through a healthy menstrual cycle, estrogen kind of peaks at different points in the cycle. So there's more of it at different points. And if we're not flushing it out and it's being reabsorbed, it's kind of getting stuck in the system. And so then when it gets reabsorbed in that way, then it just becomes toxic to the system, right? That's where it becomes AMA. And we think about estrogen as a building hormone. And so if it's building, it has to build somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's not being flushed out and goes back in the system, it's going to go somewhere to build itself, right? And so that's where we can even see like breast swelling. We can see that tenderness in the breasts. We can see bloating or even weight gain around the middle, specifically around the central area of the body, the thighs. So that can be a sign of that.
Even like fibroids, right?
Fibroids, right? So it's like, yeah, fibroids, endometriosis, PCOS, like all of these that are pushing. Again, it's like it has to grow somewhere because that's what it's made to do, is to be this builder of a hormone. So that's where we start to see all of these other types of imbalances. And again, that's where if someone comes to me with fibroids, I'm like, well, how's your digestion? And we start there because we need to know, are you flushing these hormones out or are they recirculating in the body? And there's other things, right? Like headaches and migraines can be associated, heavy or irregular menstrual cycles. So all of these can be a sign of estrogen dominance. There can be other things going on, but I'd say this term estrogen dominance is kind of used very broadly and just highlighting it could be that, but let's like look at all of these pieces together and determine if that's what it is, or get a test, or like, do some more, research and digging in there. But that's one that I think a lot of women can, relate to or have maybe thought they have and aren't sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great example for how our digestion is really at the epicenter of it all, and how I think so many of those examples that you named, like the fibroids and the PCOS and heavy menstrual cycles, breast tenderness, like I think most people aren't connecting that to digestion. So I
Mhm.
think that was really helpful to make that connection there. And even as you were saying that, I was even thinking of like UTIs, right? And UTIs, again, I think most people would be like, what do you mean that's related to my digestion? But really, UTI is an imbalance in our vaginal flora, our vaginal microbiome. And that's very much connected to our gut microbiome, our gut flora. So much comes back to digestion. Yes.
Yeah, and those, if we think about that area, like they're very closely connected, right? Like the two holes in our body and in that space are very close together. And so if you are experiencing a disruption in your digestive flora, it's going to connect directly to your vaginal flora. And so that is certainly a place to look at. Like, yeah, even if someone comes to me with a UTI, I'm like, well, how's your digestion? Let's start there and make sure things are moving down and out and down and out. Yeah. Did you want to say anything else about on that note with either the microbiome or like gut flora?
Yeah, there's so much that I want to say on the microbiome. I think, um, well, I guess maybe if that's a new term to anyone listening. So if we look at more modern research around gut health, we have been using this term microbiome, especially in the last just like 20 or so years. There's been a lot of heavy research on this understanding that we're an ecosystem. So our guts, I mean, really our whole body, but our guts in particular are made up of these trillions of bacteria. And while Ayurvedic medicine didn't necessarily use the term microbiome, as we've talked about in these episodes, Ayurveda connects everything back to gut health. And all of the research that we're understanding about the microbiome now is that the important piece for having strong digestion is what we call microbial diversity. So having a diverse ecosystem is important, is necessary. And that's not just necessary for digestive health, that's interconnected to our cognitive health and our emotional health, our mental health. Even things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, they can now identify that in someone's gut microbiome decades before we're having clinical symptoms. So, I just think that it's really interesting to look at what we understand as the microbiome. And I think where I geek out over this is it might be the one example where modern research can almost help portray our connectedness to nature better than Ayurveda. I don't think I've ever said that about anything, but when we think about our microbiome and having this healthy gut diversity, this microbial diversity, where that comes from is from our plants. And where the plants get that from is from our soil. And so, in order for us to have healthy guts, and again, having a healthy gut is connected to all aspects of our health, we need to have healthy soil. And so, I guess even though this might seem tangential on these topics of digestion, I just wanted to pause and one, say thank you to regenerative farmers and people who are out there advocating for soil health, because that is such an important part of gut health. And I think sometimes we end up in these conversations where we're really hyper focused on our individuality and our individual health. But it's really terrifying to look at the decline in soil health that's happening. And we can also see the decline in our own microbial diversity. Like they've looked at the microbiomes of mummies. I don't know how, but they've looked at the microbial diversity of mummies and seen this like drastic decline now as compared to then. And so I just think like in this grander conversation around digestion and around how to improve our individual digestive health, and it's all of the things that we mentioned are so true and so important. And I also just want to offer this bird's eye view that healing our digestive health is also very interconnected to our ecological health, the health of our earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a big tangent, but
Oh,
it felt like
yeah.
something I wanted to say.
Yeah, Rita, bringing us back to nature.
Yeah.
And the connection. And I guess going back to what you were sharing earlier is if we start bubble wrapping our diets, we're missing out on even more of that
Yeah.
support and that connection to the land and to the earth and to these other organisms that are supporting the inside of our body,
Yeah.
and how we're growing. So yeah,
Yeah.
starting with digestion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one thing now I'm just at the end and having all
Yeah.
my tangential Vata thoughts
Yeah.
here, but like I think we also live in a time when there's a lot of environmental toxins
Mhm.
that play a role in digestion as well. And I just think that's an important piece to mention. I'm thinking about when I was talking about soil health, just calling out the pesticides and things of that nature, that it all plays a role. And so it's something where we're focusing on what we can do in terms of how we're eating and when we're eating and which foods are going to be more balancing versus imbalancing. And then also coming back to this connection of, well, we also need to take care of our earth because otherwise the rest of it won't matter as much.
Yeah, and even with digestion, we have to be moving those toxins out of the body.
Yes, yes,
And if we're not moving them out, they're just getting stuck, right? And
yes.
so, yes, we have more exposure to these toxins, and I agree with everything you're saying in that regard. And the reality is that's what we're facing right now,
Yes.
and we do need to make changes to move forward and have a more sustainable future for everyone and for this planet. And we need to make sure that we are moving those toxins out of the body because they're coming in, whether we eat, do everything right, to do all the things, check all the boxes in terms of like eating all the right stuff and taking all the right herbs, right? Like we have to be moving it through the body and not allowing it to stick in there. It has to come out the other side.
That is a really good point. And I think especially where there can be so much fear as we are unraveling all the toxins in our environment, it's like, okay, well, let's advocate for the changes we want to see. But then what we can control is really supporting our body to be able to be strong detoxifiers. And such a big aspect of that is having strong digestion and regular bowel movements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, I brought us on a real big tangent there.
That's okay. Very important to cover and very relevant to this conversation. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I guess the one other piece I'll mention just to kind of end on this note, because I think this can be really overlooked in terms of relating to digestive imbalance, is low libido.
Mm,
And it's really important because I think so often we connect that to there's something wrong with me emotionally,
mm,
as opposed to, well, let's look at how the body is being supported right now. And so just to like simply connect it. So like we talked about, in our first episode of digestion, we have this breakdown process, we have this absorption process, and then we have this elimination of the waste process. And so basically, the end piece of nutrition from that process is what Ayurveda refers to as ojas and is like the essence of nutrition, right? So it is these like final pure forms, like the same way that you take sap and boil it down to maple syrup. It is this like true, pure, potent form of your health. And when there's not enough ojas because we aren't digesting well, like all the examples we just gave, for whatever reason, there's an imbalance. We're not getting that pure form of nutrition to sustain us. We see it as vitality. We see it as this sign of health. What gives our skin vibrancy, right? Like it is this ojas that sustains us and nourishes us. And when we don't have that or that's low, that is where we can feel that low libido. We feel that there's not that vitality there to support yourself, never mind support conception or,
mm,
fertility. I guess I want to help reframe the language around low libido is that there's nothing wrong with you if that's what you're experiencing. Let's look at the bigger picture and the bigger perspective of how your body is being supported right now and how you're being supported. Because again, that goes back to how the system is supporting us, right? And if
mhm,
the system's not supporting us, we need to do it ourselves.
mhm. Yeah.
All right, that's my rant for the
Yeah.
day.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess the high level overview, everything is really comes back to digestion, and that's where we start in Ayurveda. And this conversation is why. And it's still kind of funny to me, or so many clients are kind of confused, like, wait, we're starting with digestion, but I have all these other things going on. This is the why. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it's something that can take a little time, Ayurveda is a slower medicine, but at the same time, it always amazes me how when I have my first follow-up with clients, like how much change they're already seeing when we make shifts in digestion. So
yeah,
it all comes down to digestion. It all starts with digestion, and it's a powerful thing when we learn how to be in relationship with our digestion.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Rita.
Yeah. Thanks, Brittany.
If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean the world to us and help support our work if you'd like, share, leave a review, as well as subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you use. If you're looking for more connection or would like to support this podcast, we'd love to have you join our Patreon for $5 a month. Here you'll get bonus episodes and access to our community chat Q&A.
And don't forget to check out our wellness library, which is filled with self-guided classes, kitchen tutorials, herbal recipes, and more Ayurvedic practices, all for just $5 a month. Thanks so much for being here with us. Until next time, be well.